Recently, we looked at the Lightning Nova Sorceress, and a pretty common question was how it compares to the Frost Nova build. Better, worse, safer, slower? So today we answer that, as well as give you some tips on making it through the game with whichever Nova Sorceress you prefer along the way. Starting out though, let's answer that question. The Frost Nova Sorceress is indeed a bit slower than the Lightning Nova Sorceress, at least in endgame gear. And as far as how it proceeds to the mid-game or solo self-found ranges, it still somewhat holds that second place position with one key distinction. It has better tools to deal with act bosses, specifically the mana cursing Bale. This is because of the synergy and mastery styles of Cold versus Lightning. In Lightning, we had Nova as pretty much our only normal damage dealer, and we had Static Field as the synergy, which mostly just chunks down the first half of the enemy's life in hell if you use it. And we also had to invest heavily into Lightning Mastery to get that damage up to a reasonable level. With Frost Nova, most of your damage comes from actually usable skills. This is because Cold Mastery is a minus resistance effect, so plus skills can cover most of the efficiency gap with it, and you'll be investing mostly in the two synergies instead, with Blizzard being useful enough for some damage, but not really shining in this build since we lack synergies for it, but Orb actually providing significant damage due to it being designed to function with minimal investment. This results in us using Orb to kill bosses more often than not, and while Frost Nova can kill them just fine, by placing Orb on the boss, you will see a much larger spike against their life than our little area of effect skill could ever hope for. While against trash mobs and uniques, Frost Nova is more than enough to wreck face, albeit with maybe a cast or two more than the traditional Nova. The other nice thing about this is that both of these skills have fairly similar amounts of investment, with Frost Nova only being a few points higher due to prerequisites for synergies, with Nova itself being about 60 points invested in the main skill and buffs, and Frost Nova being 64, usually, so this means they both can kind of pair out with other skills about as easily as each other. So we can get that energy shield on the Frost Nova Sorceress and be super tanky, or we can invest in any one of the many hybrid setups that are also available to the traditional Nova. One important thing for both of these builds, regardless of which you pair it with, is that you want at least one hard point in Warmth to keep your mana toasty. And if possible with your setup, you want a meditation source, which usually means you're mercenary. Otherwise, you will be hungry for mana, which, while with the damage hybrids is not a big deal and can drink blues for, if you're going energy shield hybrid for tanking, then you really don't want that going down, and you do want to keep your mana up as much as possible with, well, meditation. All that said, in normal difficulty, just like with normal Nova, you're going to be chugging those mana potions regardless, since you are spamming an area of effect skill with no cooldown and a mana cost of a higher tier skill. This is just one of those things that pretty much any spell spammer in any normal difficulty situation, you'll just deal with. So getting those tier runes on your gear will help, as will the usual good starter gear like Stealth and Lore that we show off in every video pretty much. Though as you get into late normal, you'll get access to Blizzard and Orb, and may find yourself using these quite a bit more at the early stages of the game, despite them having slightly less damage. And out of the two, I would actually max Orb first once you hit 30, and only then actually go back and max out Frost Nova, and then finally Blizzard. This will just make life a lot easier since Orb tears through everything in Nightmare, even with just 1 point in Mastery, and nothing but the 1 required point in Ice Bolt. As you move into Nightmare and beyond though, you'll gain access to some of the more important upgrades. Things like your Spirit Sword, which you can also get in a shield later like we see here, and thanks to being cheap, you can strip the runes out of them and keep re-rolling until you get a 35% faster cast setup, which will be handy for whenever we swap back to Nova in Hell. You'll also get access to Insight around Nightmare, whether you use it with an Act 2 Prayer Mercenary like you have been seeing in the background, but that sometimes has an issue of being a bit squishier, or if you want to go for the Act 1 mercenary option with her tendency to stay a bit further back from the action but not giving that prayer, both can be good options. Depending on the gear you have available for the mercenary, you just want that meditation. By late Nightmare, you should also be thinking about what you want to hybrid into, since you are about to start hitting all the cold immunes. If you want to be tanky and just teleport past them, this is when you start grabbing Telekinesis and after that Energy Shield. Or if you're wanting to use a second element, this is when you start to grab that, with skills like Fire Wall and Hydra being the most common picks for me, though you can go with Fireball or even normal Nova too. I just like having my support spells be somewhat passive, so I lean away from those. Obviously, with all of this, you'll be needing to keep your mana up. If you're going damage hybrid, you really have to be splitting your vitality and energy up to this point to keep it kind of balanced so that you can stay alive and still deal damage. If you're going energy shield, most of those points should actually be going into energy, which will save you some stress here of having to balance that kind of stuff. As we get into Hell, it's all about just maxing out the rest of your skills. With energy shield build, you'll actually go fully complete with your setup at 99, with 20 in Frost Nova, Blizzard, and Orb in the Cold Tree, as well as 20 in Telekinesis and Energy Shield, with your single points in Cold Mastery, Static Field, and Warmth to round things out at 99. So simply put, don't expect this build to be at max speed until you've reached the end, but it's more than capable at functioning much earlier than that at a good pace, especially with something like a good Memory Staff on swap to help out with that Energy Shield space. Now, as far as the endgame chase gear for this build, probably the most important thing in 2.5, especially if you're using that energy shield, is going to be a Sunder Charm. Otherwise, you will be locked out of a lot of areas for farming, since we are swarm hunters, not targeted hunters. After that, it's all about taking the fast-casting Nova approach, but this time with a +% cold damage rather than -% lightning resist. Thanks to how our mastery works for this element, our first pick is going to be Nightwing's Veil for a helmet, which, while hard to find, is a great helmet for a few builds, with plus skills, plus cold damage, and a few handy add-ons, and prime real estate for a cold facet. Similarly, we go with Death's Fathom in our hand, though this one is good for a couple of reasons. Yes, it boosts our cold damage and gives us resist, and is another good target for a cold facet if you have them to spare, but it also gives us faster cast, which, if you remember from the Lightning Nova video, is pretty important to us, since we want to hit that 105% mark. This faster cast is the same reason we go with Mage Fist in this situation. There are things you can substitute these out for. You could even go with Trangs if you wanted the cold resist instead of mana recovery, though some people will ditch this and go for faster cast on their armor instead, but since I don't have a Frost Nova Ormus, this seemed more promising. That said, speaking of Ormus, I went with Chains of Honor for resist, plus all skills, and its nice packing of other stats. You could go Enigma if you wanted to cover your strength easier, but I don't mind it that much since even without battle orders, we're at almost 2,000 mana, so more stat points are not going to be that super important for me. If you need the faster cast, Skin of Viper Magi or Ormus Robes are great tools here as well, but I would generally only prefer Ormus over Viper Magi if it had the Frost Nova skill, which is sadly one I lack. Other predictable gear is going to be our belt, which is Arachnid Mesh, again plus skills and faster cast if you didn't see the pattern, as well as Dual Stones of Jordan for extra mana and plus skills, and if we move up, yes, we do the same with our amulet with plus skills and faster cast yet again. Though if you can't get the faster cast here, you may need to use one of those faster cast armors or swap out one for your rings until you can. Last up on the right is going to be our shield that you saw earlier, Spirit. With this specific setup, we need that 35% because this puts us at exactly 105% faster cast, between the amulet, the orb, the gloves, and the belt with the shield. Slightly better caster amulets can open up some flexibility here, but they are a lot more rare to come across, and this gives us plus skills and resist, which are nice. On the boots, you can use whatever you want. I'm using War Travs here for magic find and stuff, though things like Silkweave, Resist Boots, or even Water Walks will be fine. And obviously our skills are going to be cold skillers, with the usual Torch, Annihilus, and Sunder Charm, since those are kind of givens in this situation. Overall though, this build plays pretty similar to the traditional Nova Sorceress. Neither is really safer than the other, though the Cold Sorceress trades a little bit of crowd clearing for better boss killing and an easier time with Mana Curse, and it has nice alternatives for just Bale and Succubi, cause, well, you kinda need them. So, do you prefer playing with the cold, or do you like the faster clear speed of the non-bosses with lightning? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and regulars that make this content possible.